He is the author of Sense and Goodness Without God and also Not the Impossible Faith. He has a PhD in ancient history. And here he is, Richard Carrier.
Yeah. We need video, though. Thought we had that solved. I guess not. Oh, it's happening. Or is it not?
Your speakers are so picky. Get us water, get us video. Now we need a microphone.
Hey, the slides are half the fun, man.
How many skeptics does it take to turn on a projector?
Well, while we're waiting for that, I'll tell you that my talk is going to be about this book called The Christian Delusion. It's edited by John Loftus, has several chapters in it, and I'm going to be talking about that book and why you should buy it. It'll be very useful to you. It's also the book that you should give to your Christian friends if you want to introduce them to something that will outrage them, but also educate them. Do we not have it yet? The title of this book, The Christian Delusion, is a riff on Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. And Richard Dawkins got criticized a bit for being somewhat unscholarly, somewhat unthorough, or not responding directly to what Christian apologists argue, as if he was out of touch or whatever. So we took that critique up as a challenge, and we got a bunch of experts together who actually are experts in all these different fields, and put a bunch of chapters together that are scholarly and well-researched, and thoroughly cited, and do respond to the criticisms and apologetics of the field. And we focused on Christianity, of course, because that is the main bane of our existence at present. Not that Islamic people don't read our books, so that's kind of useless. But the Christians kind of are forced to, ultimately. Do we have it coming? No?
God hates you.
Yeah, well, I'm going to have more time later then, right? To make up.
We have dinner after you feed into it.
Is there something wrong here? No, you would have blank screen if it was...
Yeah?
Yeah, you would have like a blue screen if it was... Something's happening.
All right, everybody pray.
Which is a classic example. Like I can see it's happening. So if you all did pray, this would be a proof of answered prayer.
It's got to warm up for just a second.
Yeah.
Do me a favor. Plug your book and call Rebecca Watson out and sell buttons.
Yeah, JT wants me to call Rebecca Watson out and sell buttons. I'm too even keel to do that kind of thing, though. I think it's really 50-50 odds as to which one of us will get drunkest, the quickest.
It'll probably depend on who buys the more buttons.
Yeah, yes. Well, true. JT says it depends on who buys the most buttons. He's trying to plug the buttons, which is a way for you to donate and have a little souvenir of this event. And help support not only this event, but hopefully encourage them to, and maybe give them a little extra money to support Skepticon 4 next year. But in terms of the drinking game, I give it 50-50 odds which of us will collapse first. However, all of you wearing Team Watson buttons, it makes logical sense that you should all be buying me drinks tonight. Right? I'm just saying. All right, let's begin. The topic of my talk today is, are Christians delusional? Let's find out. First, we got to define terms. What do we mean by delusion? There's the colloquial sense of delusion, which is a false belief or opinion. For example, he has delusions of grandeur is a common phrase. I'm not talking about that. The other is from psychiatry, which is a false belief that is resistant to reason or confrontation with actual fact. Now, there's a politically correct version of this psychiatric term that you'll find in actual diagnostic models that makes an exception for religion without actually telling you that's what it's doing. And this is the actual formal definition: a false belief based on an incorrect inference about external reality that is firmly sustained despite what almost everybody else believes, notice that insertion there, and despite what constitutes incontrovertible and obvious proof or evidence to the contrary. Now, I want you to take that bit in italics and take it out, And let's just read the definition, the formal psychiatric definition. A false belief based on an incorrect inference about external reality that is firmly sustained despite what constitutes incontrovertible and obvious proof or evidence to the contrary. Obviously, if you take that little section out, that little italicized part, you still are talking about a delusion. I mean, it's quite clearly that's what we're talking about here. Just because you have everybody in the room is deluded doesn't mean suddenly that it's no longer a delusion. You just have the whole room is deluded. And so anyway, so I'm going to not use the politically correct definition. I'm going to talk about just the basic definition, a false belief that is resistant to reason or confrontation with actual fact. And I'll say that not all false beliefs are delusions. There's lots of different kinds of false belief, and I could give a whole lecture on all the different kinds, but I'm only going to talk about one delusion as one particular kind of false belief. And for a false belief to be a delusion, it has to meet these three criteria, all three. The first is certainty. It has to be held with absolute conviction. If you're kind of wishy-washy about it, it doesn't really qualify. It also has to have incorrigibility. That means it's not changeable by compelling counter-argument or proof to the contrary. And that's one of the key features of delusion. And the third criterion is impossibility or falsity of content. In other words, it has to be implausible, bizarre, or patently untrue. Now, there are different kinds of delusion. Delusion comes in many degrees. Here you got my official Dr. Carrier delusion scale. You go from mildly delusional. Now, we all are mildly delusional. Actually, psychology has proven that we all harbor a variety of different kinds of mild delusions. Guys often think they're hotter than they are. Women often think they're less hot than they actually are. And they can actually show this with objective tests. They can have everybody in the room look at your picture and rate how attractive you are, and then have you rate how attractive you are, and you can see the difference between the average objective measure and your measure. These are the kinds of mild delusions you have. One of the common ones is people overestimate how competent they are at a skill. And ironically, the less competent you are, the more you overestimate your competence at the skill. And this is a universal thing. It's the way our brains work. And anyway, so there are mild delusions. Then there are majorly delusional people. There's people that get worrisome and then crazy and then, of course, batshit insane. Now, for today, I'm only going to talk about the majorly delusional. I'm not talking about the worrisome Christians or the complete batshit insane Christians. I'm going to talk about just ordinary majorly delusional Christians. I'm also not going to be talking about mildly delusional Christians. Now, what are we talking about Christianity? Let's define Christianity here. Now, I can't take credit for this. I did not invent this quote. I don't know who the author is, so props to them, whoever they are. Maybe someone can find out and blog it or something. But you can find it on the internet. It's actually a completely 100% accurate description of what Christianity is. The belief that some cosmic Jewish zombie can make you live forever if you symbolically eat his flesh and telepathically tell him that you accept him as your master so he can remove an evil force from your soul that is present in humanity because a rib woman was convinced by a talking snake to eat from a magical tree. And there really isn't a single proposition in there that your average Christian can honestly deny. Yeah, that's what we believe. What can I say? Now, though, there are a lot of Christians now who've really taken a lot of flack for that, and so we've come out with a new improved Christianity of the maybe last 50 years or so, where they admit, okay, all that Eve stuff is baloney, the rib woman, talking snake, okay, maybe that's all myth. But I still have an imaginary friend who magically manipulates the world for me, and he also magically impregnated a woman 2,000 years ago, and she bore him a son who underwent an ancient ritual of blood sacrifice in order to dispel a curse laid upon me, thus ensuring I will be immortal, although I've never seen this work for anyone else before. So that's what we're dealing with. That's Christianity. That's the belief that we're going to test. Is that a delusion? Now, there are varieties of Christians as well. There's nominal apathetic Christians, Christians who just say they're Christian but don't really believe any of it, or don't even care whether it's true or not. I'm not talking about those Christians today. There's also Christians who don't really know if it's true. It's a sort of a metaphor or something. They have different kinds of ideas, very liberal Christians that you can often have a really hard time trying to pin them down on what actually they believe. I'm not talking about those Christians either. I'm talking about the Christians that it's true as told Christians. And the same ones who say it's all true and Jesus is coming from outer space to kill you soon. That's actual polled results. 40% of the American public believes that, by the way. So we could talk about maybe about 60% of Christians are that it's true as told but aren't so sure about when Jesus is going to come and kill us. But, And there's also a split between what I call the mildly delusional and the majorly delusional Christians. And the mildly delusional ones have personal belief in God, like God exists and Jesus was a great guy. But they have room to move. They'll waffle a little bit on the divine issues of Jesus and so forth. These kinds of happy-go-lucky Christians, I'm not going to be talking about today. I think that's kind of a mild delusion. It's kind of like somebody who thinks they can telepathically communicate with their pets. It doesn't really hurt anyone. It's still a delusion, but I'm talking about that Jesus is truly the Son of God and whatnot, and that's what I mean by majorly delusional, or at least I claim it's majorly delusional. Let's see if I'm right. Now, what if someone came up to you and said that they have an imaginary friend named Zalmoxis, who they insist is really real? He's not imaginary, in fact, and they'll never die because this ancient demigod cleansed their soul with blood magic, which grants them the power of living forever in a magical place no one can see. Now, you would immediately peg that as a delusion. It's bizarre, implausible, and patently untrue. Zalmoxis' cult, in fact, is attested in Herodotus, the historian, in 425 BC, 500 years before Christianity. Let me take you back to that. That's a description of an actual religion practiced 500 years before Christianity and possibly still being practiced in the time Christianity was invented. This looks very familiar, don't you think? Think about that. Another example I'm going to give you is the Heaven's Gate cult. I'm sure a lot of you know about this cult. They believed that a spaceship was behind Comet Hale-Bopp that was going to come and rescue them and transfer their souls from their current shells, their current bodies, into new special bodies in the spaceship, and they were going to fly away and live forever in this spaceship. And they were so convinced of this belief that several dozen of them committed suicide, mass suicide. They're actually, not all of them did, by the way. There actually are still Heaven's Gators around, and they still believe this thing. It could rise up as the new Scientology in 50 years. Who knows? But their belief, I have to point out, it was based on the idea of getting new bodies in an alien spaceship flying by. We regard this as patently absurd, implausible, and bizarre, but at least has all the elements of plausibility in the sense that spaceships are at least scientifically possible, and the idea of having your body or having the information in your brain re-imprinted on another body that's actually better built than your current one is not only plausible in the sense that it's physically possible, but we'll probably actually be able to do that within 1,000 years' time of technological development. So they're not really that far out on the fringe, and yet we all recognize this is a crazy idea. Now compare this with what the Christians believe. They believe that they're going to get new bodies in a magical alternate universe. That's not as plausible. There's no science to support this. There are no magical alternate universes that we have any evidence of. So actually, it's either the same belief or at least less plausible even than what the Heaven's Gate people believed. And their whole theory, they actually had it worked out as the idea of quantum teleportation and neural engineering, quantum teleportation of the information in their current brains to neurally re-engineer the brains of their new bodies in the spaceship, versus the Christian idea that God needs blood to fix the universe, but only his own blood had enough magical power to do it, so he gave himself a body and killed it. Which one of these two religions makes more sense? So if the Zalmoxians and the Heaven's Gators were delusional, so are Christians. That's the point I'm trying to make here. And so we've nailed one of the three requirements here: impossibility or falsity of content, implausible, bizarre, or patently untrue. Now, I won't leave it at that. I'm going to point out how you can actually make this case using the Christian delusion. Christian delusion is divided into 5 parts. I'll talk about part 2 first. And that's why the Bible is not God's word. And there's a reason we break it down like this, and I'll point that out later. There's a chapter by Edward Babinski on the cosmology of the Bible. It's important to note that the Old Testament God, this is the Old Testament, the voice of God, in quotations, himself, speaks with the assumption routinely that the earth is flat and held up by 4 pillars. Now, if even God didn't know how the world was made, you can be fairly certain that the Bible was not written by God or by anyone who was in communication with him. This basic idea of water, there's this giant sea up in outer space. In fact, outer space is an ocean, and then there's this big metal firmament that God put to separate that ocean from the ocean below, and then the atmosphere is in between. The atmosphere, this big dome, is held up by 4 pillars. That's the pillars of heaven, and then the earth is flat and held up by 4 pillars, which is the pillars of the earth. This is the common cosmology. It was believed, this is the structure of the universe as believed by all the neighbors of Israel when the Old Testament was written. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, and the Sumerians. Babinski shows this, documents it extensively. They use the same metaphors, the same terminologies, the same concepts. Everything worked in the same place. So when you see it in the Bible, you know this is just a product of its culture. This is not a, an insightful, inspired text from the God of the universe, that God who would certainly know that the earth was round and there wasn't, outer space wasn't filled with water. Another point, and this is something I won't go into in detail because I'd be preaching to the choir, but you know these things, the Bible and modern scholarship. Modern scholars pretty much all agree that the Bible is bullshit. They don't put it like that, but when you add up all the things they say, you say, oh, well, that's what you're saying, is it's bullshit. Well, don't say anyone that's what we're saying, but that's what we're saying. The Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, Paul Tobin has a good summary. It's a short chapter that summarizes some of the best examples. Of course, there's hundreds of these. But he summarized some of the best examples that are most secured by best scholarship, and he cites the scholars and the scholarship, supporting each of these 5 points. That the Bible is inconsistent with itself. It's not supported by archaeology. In fact, archaeology refutes the Bible on many points. It contains fairy tales and failed prophecies, demonstrably failed prophecies, and many forgeries. Both the New Testament and the Old Testament contain books that we know are forged. They were not written when or by whom they claim to be. And that's mainstream scholarship, by the way. It's not fringe at all. So, the book can't be God's word if these things are true. And then John Loftus has a chapter on what we've got here is a failure to communicate. Those of you who know the movie will get the line, but I won't go into that. And he demonstrates in elaborate detail that one thing that God would do if God inspired the Bible or wrote it or whatever is that he would make sure that his message was clear. He'd make sure that you got it like this. These are the morals. This is what's moral. This is what's right and wrong. This is what I want from you. This is what's going to happen. But he's not. He's massively confusing text. In fact, it's so confusing it leads to massive confusion among Christian churches who actually killed each other over these. One of the classic examples is, can I have sex slaves or not? Actually, the Bible is consistent on this. You can. There really is no passage in the Bible that says you can't. Frankly. And there are 3 passages in the Bible that explicitly declare that you can and give specific instructions on how to manage your sex slaves. So the Bible's not God's word. Part 3 is why the Christian God is not perfectly good. So let's say you say, well, okay, maybe the Bible is full of a lot of errors and stuff, or it's all metaphorical or something. And so we can't really know for sure whether it's God's word, but at least God is perfectly good. Well, there are 2 arguments against that. The first is that the God that's depicted in the Bible, the character of Yahweh, is a moral monster. And Hector Avalos has a great chapter showing that Yahweh, as depicted in the Old Testament, is just as big of a douchebag and asshole as all the other gods around him among the Sumerians and Babylonians and so forth. I mean, he's the same jerk, basically. Does the same things, says the same things that you would recognize as basically, not the kind of guy that you would respect or worship, and as Hector Havalos calls it, a moral monster, which is the polite way of putting it. There was actually a guy by the name of Paul Copan who actually said, no, God did all those things, but they're not really monstrous because God had excuses, or God can do whatever he wants, and Hector Avalos takes him in on that. But he shows that all the surrounding Bible codes, all the surrounding law codes of the peoples around Israel were either as enlightened or more enlightened than the law code we find in the the Old Testament. Which shows that the Christian God is not perfectly good if you go by the Bible God. Well, let's say you reject the Bible God, you still got this idea of God left, right? Well, John Loftus has a chapter called The Darwinian Problem of Evil, where he decisively proves that the needless suffering of animals, and I'm not talking about farm animals, I'm just talking about regular animals out in the wild for the past 4 billion years, that monstrous, unnecessary suffering is inexcusable. And there's no possible way God could create this universe and still be considered perfectly good. And he addresses these responses to this. A lot of Christian apologists are really worried about this argument and have been for years. You might not have ever heard of it, but they've developed a lot of really bizarre, crazy excuses to weasel out of it, and some of them are quite shocking. And he fantastically did his research, and he documents every single one in response to them. It's a good one. I also recommend this bonus chapter that I wrote that didn't get in the book called The Will of God. It's 24 verses from the Old Testament that decisively show what a dickhead Yahweh was. And you can find that on our companion site for the book, sites.google.com/site/The Christian Delusion. Then there's the why Jesus is not the risen Son of God, part 4. That's the other part of the Christian argument, right? That Jesus has to be the Son of God, otherwise Christianity isn't true in any really metaphysical sense. And Robert Price has a chapter where he shows that mainstream rejection of the Gospels as not being historical evidence is valid, despite a lot of recent Christian scholars attempting to argue against this. I have my chapter on the resurrection, where I point out that we do not have adequate historical evidence to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. In fact, the evidence looks the other way. This is actually my best refutation of this argument. So if you want to find the definitive knockdown of Christian resurrection apologetics, that's the chapter to go to. And then John Loftus has, at best, Jesus was a failed apocalyptic prophet, proving conclusively that Jesus said he'd come back in like 20 to 40 years. The fact that he didn't decisively proves that he was wrong, and since God can't have failed to predict his own return, Jesus can't possibly have been God. So we've got here Christianity is definitely implausible, bizarre, and patently untrue. And you all know this, but you can see that the case laid out there. And it has nice, good, short chapters that really get down to the point and are thoroughly documented. Part 2 is designed to refute the Bible as God's word, Christians. Part 3 is designed to refute that God is good, Christians. Part 4 is designed to refute that Jesus is God, Christians. And really, it does. I mean, there's no argument for them left to make that makes any reasonable sense. But just for good measure, in case there were any Christianities left, we tacked Part 1 in the front and Part 5 on the back. And Part 1 really gives the coherence to the whole book. Part 1 is addresses the I don't need evidence Christians. And Part 5 addresses the but we need it Christians. What do I mean by that? I'll do Part 5 last, but I want to give you the general thesis here. You can break Christianity down into various different forms, and they all overlap, so they're not distinct forms, but when you add them all up, you've got one whole pizza pie. When you eat all those pieces of the pizza, there's no pizza left. So once you destroy all of these different versions of Christianity, there's no Christianity left to rebut. So let me get back to that one point. Why society does not, I could call that the Jesus wheel, by the way. Jesus wheel pizza. Why society does not depend on Christian faith. That's the argument is that, okay, it might be false, but society would go to hell in a handbasket if we gave up Christian belief. So we should convince people to believe it anyway because it's good for society, necessary for society. And there are a variety of different ways this is argued. One, of course, is that Christianity provides the basis for moral values. And so if Christianity, we get rid of it, no one will be moral, so we really need to convince people that it's true, even if it's not. David Eller refutes this from the perspective of an anthropologist of religion. He's an actual anthropologist of religion, wrote literally the textbook on the anthropology of religion. And he argues very convincingly and thoroughly that Christianity is just one basis among many for different moral views, and it's not a very good one at that. So we don't need Christianity. There are lots of options that we can replace Christianity with. The other is atheism. You often hear that atheism was the cause of the Holocaust, the subtext being that that's where we're going to go if we get rid of Christianity. It's going to be the Holocaust all over again. And I'll tell you right now, this is my favorite chapter by Hector Avalos in this book. And you can tell that carries some weight because it's not one of mine. And he says, point out, atheism was not the cause of the Holocaust. And he has a really excellent comparison of the program, the written, declared program of Martin Luther, the founder of Lutheranism, and the Nazi program against the Jews. I mean, point by point by point. I mean, they're identical, essentially. Whereas you don't find that there's none of those points in Darwin, for example. There's none of you can read all the texts of Darwin, you're not going to find Martin Luther's list of things to do to the Jews. But you get it from Martin Luther. And he shows conclusively that Nazism itself was basically a Christian movement. It wasn't an atheistic movement. It was very Christian, inspired by Christianity, specifically German forms of Christianity, Martin Luther being one such. And of course, he also demonstrates that Hitler wasn't an atheist, contrary to popular myth. Another one of the what we needed arguments is Christianity was responsible for modern science. And you think, what the hell? I have a chapter on this. This is right in my field. I study ancient science. I'm an expert in it. So when these Christians say these things, I know of what I speak, definitely. So I have this chapter called Christianity Was Not Responsible for Modern Science, where I lay out the argument that they've actually made and show why it's complete bullshit. Not only bullshit in terms of being completely illogical, but also in terms of being factually wrong on almost every single point. But you might wonder, who makes this argument? Are you serious? Yes, there are several popular conservative textbooks that say this. I'll give you one of them, a quote from one of them. As a new generation of historians, sociologists, and philosophers of science has proven, biblical religion was not the enemy of science, but rather the intellectual matrix that made it possible in the first place. Without the key insights that Christianity found celebrated in the Bible and spread throughout Europe, science would never have happened. The evidence is incontrovertible. It was the rational theology of both the Catholic Middle Ages and the Protestant Reformation, inspired by the explicit and implicit truths revealed in the Jewish Bible, that led to the discoveries of modern science. That's just one quote. I have others in my chapter in this book. The entire paragraph is bullshit, every single line. There's also one that didn't get in the book that you think might be missing. Is an obvious one, that Christianity gave us democracy. If we get rid of Christianity, we get rid of democracy. I have that chapter written. It's online. It's an update of an old article of mine called Christianity Was Not Responsible for American Democracy. It's also available at the Christian Delusion Companion site. I'll give you a spoiler on the thesis of the thing. Those dirty little pagans invented it. And there's not a jot about democracy in the Bible. It's totally a pagan institution. So that brings us back to the last one, part 1, which is the I don't need evidence Christians. And this is one of the best sections of the book, and it's one that I think you can read, you really should read, because it's not only applicable to religion, it's applicable to all your decision-making in your life. Because it's going to educate you on how your brain has evolved to make mistakes. Your brain is inherently built by natural selection to screw up. And you have to compensate for those errors if you're going to think rationally and accurately. And these chapters nail these things in several ways. David Eller talks about how Christian evangelists in foreign countries actually use established anthropological and psychological science against people in order to spread the faith. They use what has been learned by anthropologists and have several textbooks explaining how to manipulate people in different cultures to adopt Christian belief. And it's a very interesting thing, but it also educates you on how much of your mind is basically permeated with cultural assumptions that you take for granted, and how much culture affects how you see things and understand things. And by showing how that is manipulated to control you, you can understand how to resist that manipulation and avoid the pitfalls of it. And then Valerie Terrico and Jason Long have a Christian belief through the lens of cognitive science and the malleability of the human mind. Both cover all the psychology of these kind of natural errors, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. And John Loftus rounds it out by revisiting his outsider test for faith, which is one thing that he's famous for. He's actually the ex-protege of William Lane Craig, so he knows William Lane Craig's tricks. He was once an evangelical intellectual under him. Now he's an avid, hardcore atheist. And what is the outsider test for faith? It's very simple and common sense, really. You must test your own religious claims and texts by the same standards you apply to other religions. That's it. That's all the test your religion has to pass. If your religion's claims and texts fare no better, however, then your religion is just as false as theirs is. Now, this seems like an obvious thing to say, and yet there are many Christians who've blown their top over this and insisted that he's wrong, that this test doesn't apply, that we can ignore this test, and so forth, which is astonishing. But there are reasons why we need to test our religious belief or any worldview by the same standards we test the ones we reject. So if we reject a religion for X, Y, and Z reasons, and those reasons also hold for this other religion we're looking at, we got to reject it too, otherwise we're being inconsistent. Why do we have to do this? We have to do this because the religion we assume, and not just religion, political views, anything else based on your geography and where you were, other beliefs can have this exact same background. One of the reasons to get a clue on this is that the choice of religious belief is positively correlated with cultural and geographic familiarity and access. Mostly Christians in America, mostly Muslims in the Middle East, mostly Buddhists in Asia. That generally is not what you see when one of these is a true religion. Generally, you see this pattern when religion is basically a cultural assumption rather than something that's true. Contrast this with science. There's no American science, Muslim science, and Buddhist science. Science is the same everywhere. Physics is the same everywhere. There's a reason why that is, because science gets to the truth of things and people see it gets to the truth of things. Religion doesn't really, so people pick their religion based on the one that's immediately available to them or the one that they were indoctrinated in, and then they go on throughout their life assuming that that's the norm against which they should measure everything else. So if you were born in the Middle East, you'd probably be a Muslim, not a Christian. That's the sort of thing you can ask a Christian, like, well, and then would you be just as convinced that Islam was true? Another reason to get a clue about this is that religious belief is negatively correlated with intelligence, education, and self-esteem. And in the Christian Delusion, Terrico and Long cite the studies that confirm all of these things. Basically, the smarter you are, the less likely you are to believe. The more you know, the less likely you are to believe. And the more self-respect you have, the less likely you are to believe. Now, the relationships aren't strong, but they're strong enough to be a warning to someone that you should actually strive to educate yourself to know more, to be smarter, and you can make yourself smarter, by the way. Intelligence is learnable. You should strive to do these things and strive to have more self-respect so that you can evaluate religion objectively and not pursue religion as some sort of mollification for things that you find lacking in yourself. In addition to all that, our intuition is totally fucked up. And we've confirmed this. This was mentioned the other day, hyperactive agency detection. It's actually built into our brains. We over-attribute agency to things that happen in the world. And there's a great quote in there. I probably won't have time to read it. I wish I did, but I'm going to skip over it. If you want to know about this brain module that over-identifies agency, the Christian Delusion has a great section on it, talking about it. A lot of actual experts in cognitive science and the history of religion have studied this, and it's been confirmed that this is the way the brain normally works. It's the way you've evolved to work, so that you're actually prone to recognize or assume that there's a conscious purpose behind things that happen. So you might catch yourself arguing with your car, for example. That's the same kind of thing, but you've grown beyond the point where you can immediately correct that information. You can argue with your car, but you know there isn't really a soul operating your car. But people who don't make that connection, who don't start to realize, oh, there isn't really a soul in my car, that's basically religion, except instead of the car, it's in the universe or whatever. There are various other examples like this. One is that fear-based messages suppress critical reflection, and this has been confirmed by psychologists. If I scare you, if I say you're going to go to hell or you're going to lose $1 million or lose your house or something, the moment I've scared you, your odds of actually evaluating what I say next in terms of critical evaluation go down substantially. And they've actually done control tests where they give information to someone or make an argument to someone who hasn't been scared, and then they make an argument to someone with the fear-based message in front of it, and the people in the fear-based section believe what was told them to a higher percentage than the people in the control group. So your brain is actually hardwired to say, oh, this is scary, this is important information, it's important that I believe it. And it's the same basic problem with hyperactive agency detection. As cavemen, it made more sense to err in the direction of caution. If you overbelieve things that are dangerous, you're going to catch all the dangerous things, and you might do a few mistakes that aren't dangerous or not as dangerous. Whereas if you underdetect danger, then something dangerous is going to get you. So the odds of you being killed by underdetecting danger are higher than the odds of you getting killed if you overdetect danger. So we're designed to overdetect danger, which means we're extremely manipulable by fear. And that's actually how we've evolved to be. It's a basic error that our brains make, and you should be on the watch out for it, because it's not just religion that can be used. They can use this factor to manipulate you. Politics, media, corporations, everybody can do it. Another one is time increases confidence faster than evidence, and this is a weird one. You can take a control group and give them more evidence, and start with a claim and give them increasingly amounts of evidence and see how more their belief increases. Or you can give someone no new evidence and just let them wait amount of time, and the longer they believe something, and they do rates of how certain they are it's true, the rates of how certain they are it's true go up over time, even though no new evidence has been accrued. And we all behave this way. Our brains are actually built to do this, that the amount of time that you believe something is misperceived as increasing evidence that it's true, even though there's no increased evidence. Whereas increasing evidence has actually a lesser effect. It has an effect. It increases percentage or certainty, but its increase in certainty is actually less impressive than the time one. And that's completely irrational, and yet that's the way the brain works, and you've got to be on your guard against it. Another is that rationalization is an autonomous instinct. This was pointed out earlier yesterday. Really good example that your brain makes a decision for emotional reasons first and then comes up with intellectual reasons to believe it. Now, if your emotions are well trained, that works reasonably well, and if your reason is trained enough to be self-critical, so you're like, well, I better check that to be sure, then you can correct your errors that this process makes. But you have to learn to do that. If you don't learn to do that, your brain automatically rationalizes anything that you want to believe. So that people who aren't trained critical thinkers, who don't take the bother of living the self-examined life and teaching them how to question themselves and not be sure that their instinct works all the time, those people are going to be highly prone to being certain that they're true, but they'll have all these great intellectual reasons, but none of those reasons were the actual reason that they came to the belief and maintained the belief. Another is instinctive false generalization, and this is one of the things that surprised me when I actually read the chapters for this book, is that if you present someone with, like, say, 3 arguments for a position, and one of them is weak and the other 2 are strong, and they can refute the weak argument, people automatically assume that they can refute the strong arguments. So that actually adding a weak argument to two strong arguments actually worsens your case. It'll actually convince them that you're wrong. So it's actually counterproductive to add a weak argument in. You should only lead with strong arguments and not give them a weak one to do. And our brains are actually designed to do this, that if we can catch a problem with the weak argument, we assume that the whole slew of arguments thrown at us are of the same type, and that we can dismiss them all. And it's a way of saving time, in a sense, that you don't have to sit there and evaluate every single piece of evidence. If one or two don't work out for you, you can basically sort of use an easy heuristic and just reject all of them and then move on to something else. It's irrational, but it's the way our brains evolved to work, and psychologists have proved that that is how our brains work. So we need to act against that and guard against that. And another common one is confirmation bias is innate. We're actually designed to have confirmation bias, to look for evidence for things for claims and for beliefs. We don't look for evidence against claims and beliefs, even though that's the scientific method, by the way. What makes the scientific method contrary to common sense is that instead of looking for evidence for a belief, we actually design a test or something that's designed to find evidence against our belief, if there is any. And that's why science actually works so well, because it works against the way we were evolved to think. And it's important to realize that, and that's another part of skepticism in science, and it affects everything we do, like our political decisions and everything. It's not just religion. But the fact that all these things are inherent is a very strong reason that any Christian or any religious person has to really be extremely skeptical of their religion and make sure that it passes tests, the same tests that they apply to all other religions, because there's all these different easy reasons that they could be misled into their worldview. Now, there's some bad news from all of this, that psychology does trump reason most of the time. And these are studies also discussed in the Christian Delusion. Face-to-face argument is more persuasive than indirect communications. So people who come knocking on your door trying to sell the gospel to you are more effective, even if they have weaker arguments, than a book or the internet. And this has been proven. It's the way people work. It makes no sense, but there it is. But it's worth pointing this out to people, that they're very susceptible to this. And you should be aware that you're susceptible to it. And avoidance behavior is natural. If you have this comforting belief that you need, or if you think you've been convinced that challenging this belief or questioning this belief is dangerous, you'll engage in avoidance behavior. And that means swallowing lousy arguments rather readily. Any argument that you can escape with, you will. And avoiding exposure to opposition. So that means not reading our books, not going to atheist conferences, not going on the internet, avoiding forums. Even ones who get challenging and actually go and interact with us often run away. And that's avoidance behavior. It's irrational, but it's how people behave. And another is the fallacy of poisoning the well actually works. It's a proven psychological principle that if you try to argue that someone is immoral or there's something wrong with them or they're a bad person, then all their arguments can be ignored, even if they have really solid evidence and their arguments are completely sound. So if you ever wonder why atheists have to be vilified constantly by Christians, they're poisoning the well. They're trying to tell people atheists are bad people, therefore their arguments have to be bad as well. And it's a fallacy. It's irrational, but it's psychologically innate. These are problems. Nevertheless, we have this outsider test for faith. We can prove that it's a rational way to go. You must test your own religious claims and texts by the same standards. So why don't they? The response that John Loftus has gotten, and he actually presented this argument at a conference of evangelical philosophers, and they all wrote responses, and his chapter in this book is a response to their responses. And basically, you can divide the responses into two things, two different ways of responding. And one is, we don't have to test our faith by the same standards we test others. Full stop. Hypocrisy rocks. That's one. That's patently irrational. So that's like delusion rearing its ugly head full on. I mean, you might as well just tattoo delusional right on your forehead if you're going to say that. Because that's the mantra of a delusional person. The second one is that our religion passes the outsider test because we have all this awesome evidence. And then, of course, that's what the rest of the book shows is not the case. So we've got the second leg here, incorrigibility. It's not changeable by compelling counter-argument or proof to the contrary. They claim they have all this awesome evidence, even when they've been shown plainly that they don't, or they retreat into irrational rejections of rational thought. Now let's talk about the last one. Sam Harris just came out with a book called The Moral Landscape. It's not forthcoming. When I wrote the slides, it was forthcoming. It's actually out now. I got an advanced look at this book. It's a pretty good book. especially if you're a fan of Sam Harris, I recommend it. It's not fully philosophically rigorous, but it's got a lot of great science in it, and so I do recommend it. And I'm, of course, the philosopher who argues for his position. And I argued for it before he even knew I was arguing for it, but I argue for it using all the philosophical terminology. So I'm kind of like I told him I'm Huxley to his Darwin, or the other way around. But one thing he points out in this book, and this is what his dissertation, and he has his PhD now in cognitive science, he talks about his dissertation work on the study of belief as an emotion. And one thing that he and other psychologists and cognitive scientists have established is that what we call belief, this certainty that something is true, is actually an emotion. It's like, it's like love or joy or any of these other, it's actually an emotional state and an emotional evaluator in the brain. We've actually located it in the brain. We know where physically in the brain certainty is generated. And we know it can misfire just like all other emotions can. You can fall in love with someone that you really isn't the same person you thought they were. You can be joyous for the wrong reasons and so on. Another classic example of this that's a parallel to delusion is a phobia. Now, a phobia is an intense emotion, in this case fear, triggered by an inappropriate stimulus, like flying in an airplane, spiders, or sour things. Does anybody know what the fear of sour things is? It's an actual condition. All right. I'll buy a drink for someone who comes up with it later. It actually has a clinical name. Yeah, so there's people who are actually deathly afraid of sour things. They're terrified of them. Now, what makes a phobia is that there's no rational connection between the emotion or its intensity and the stimulus. Flying in an airplane, spiders, and sour things simply aren't that scary. I mean, really, objectively, nor that dangerous. So intensely fearing them is irrational. And we recognize this. We recognize a phobia is not a rational belief, and it's something that you can even say it's kind of a form of delusion. And people will often easily recognize that it's a problem that if they have a phobia that they need to be cured of, and there are ways to cure it. Delusion is basically just like that. A delusion is an intense emotion, in this case certainty, triggered by an inappropriate stimulus, bizarre claims made in an old book. Now, for example, there is no rational connection between the emotion or its intensity and the stimulus. The gospel simply isn't that convincing, really. Thus, being intensely certain it's true is irrational. Thus, intensely believing it is irrational. So that gives us the last leg. A delusion consists of certainty held with absolute conviction. So I've established all three. The book gives you all you need to know to establish every single one of them. Christianity is a delusion. I'll give you some good news. Psychology has shown some things that we can make use of. One is that the more that someone is forced to defend a belief over long periods of time especially, but even in short-term settings, the more you're forced to defend a belief, the more you have to think about it, and that process itself can actually, to a certain percentage, measurable percentage, counteract all the other irrational things that I was talking about earlier. So the more you force them to think about the weirdness of their religion or the lack of evidence or the challenges to it, the more percentage of Christians are going to start walking away. It's not going to convert everybody, but it's going to increase the number who do walk away. And cognitive dissonance is an emotional state that's uncomfortable when you are entertaining two beliefs that you really want to believe in, but they contradict each other. Or there are two options that you have to choose one or the other. You can't choose them both. And they're really important options, and it makes it difficult to choose between them. This state of cognitive dissonance feels extremely uncomfortable because it's obvious that your brain needs to make a decision. And so this emotion of discomfort is there to push you to go one way or the other. Now, when the purpose of course, is to make decisions. That's the kind of thing the caveman needed it for. But now, when belief becomes a decision, whether to believe something or not, cognitive dissonance can actually can create problems for you because you might end up with contradictory beliefs. And now your only solution is to give up one or the other belief or come up with some rationalization that eliminates the contradiction. Now, if you combine and sustain both of these, you force people into cognitive dissonance. And one thing that's shown is that the starker the contradictions, the bigger the contradictions are, the more impressive or emotionally effective they are, or the starker the options, the more that cognitive dissonance works. So if you combine and sustain both, strong cognitive dissonance creating arguments regarding internal contradictions in their particular beliefs, and forcing them constantly to defend their belief, if you combine and sustain both, it's an effective deconverter of a significant enough percentage of any population, let's say even if it were 10% per generation, that gives us the win over like 100 years, for example. So these are the kinds of things that psychology can help us understand. And the purpose of this book is to help you do that. It's a whole toolkit with a lot of information that you can use going out there, and it also will educate you in how to construct your worldview and be aware of the way your brain makes mistakes and how to overcome them. And it's got a lot of great fun stuff in it as well. There are digs at Christians in there, well, Christians that maybe even most Christians think are crazy. Some of that's in there. But it's a good read. I would really please encourage you to buy it because it's my only source of income right now is selling my books. So if you want to support my work, please buy my books. I might have to buy them back and then I'll be out of money instead of making a profit or something. So my wife certainly wants me to make money, so please help me out with that. I've also written 2 books that are also helpful for this, and they address 2 things that you need to know when you go out armed amongst the Christian wolves, as it is. One is philosophy and the other is ancient history. And so I've written 2 books that are related to this. My book on philosophy is Sense and Goodness Without God, which is a complete worldview. And you don't have to agree with it, but it gives you an example of how to construct a complete worldview based on science, evidence, and reason, rather than just picking piecemeal or adopting some existing product. I cover epistemology, morality, aesthetics, politics, and metaphysics, everything. And I show how it's all connected and why you need to have a worldview too that's also built on this. It's got bibliographies, the whole deal. So it's an extremely useful tool for going out and answering philosophical questions and addressing, and also for building your own worldview and coming up with a well-evidenced, coherent worldview of your own, even if assuming you don't agree with the one that I've built. And Not the Impossible Faith gives you the whole background of the origins of Christianity in terms of, by addressing these arguments that Christianity was so impossible, it could only have succeeded if Jesus was really resurrected from the dead. There's a particular evangelist by the name of J.P. Holding who makes this argument. My book is a point-by-point refutation of his crazy, inane, illogical, false claims about it. But in the process, you get a lot of the fun of seeing this guy get trashed, but you also get educated about ancient sociology, ancient religion, the context of ancient Christianity, ancient Judaism, a lot of things you might not have known. And armed with that information, you'll find that very useful in dealing with Christian arguments. So both of these books will help you evangelize for atheism if that's what you want to do. Do it online, for example, is the easiest way for you to do it, or going out personally in some way or another doing it. Or if you're not going to do it yourself, it would be helpful if you could financially support those of us who do so that we can do the work for you. Either way, any of those things would be great, but I'd especially like to see lots of people going out and spreading the meme, as it were. But when you go out there trying to evangelize for atheism, don't do this. Don't do that. I'm not asking you to go do that. I'm asking you to do something more like this. I don't know who this guy is. You could probably call him or her. They've got to be at least a little crazy and have a lot of time on their hands, but hey. Now imagine if we had people who were paid to just drive this car around and answer the phone, So that's my talk about the Christian delusion. If we have time, I don't know if we do, I can take questions. Where are we on our time? Or is no one even paying attention, because I haven't. Okay, sure, let's do it. I didn't even think I'd be in on time. Excellent.
Okay, so you mentioned how Christians vilify atheists and such, and then I've heard other speakers say that atheists being at the bottom of the political totem pole. So obviously there's an image issue that needs to be changed or worked on. How could someone help improve that image?
Yeah, I'm not the one to ask, really. There are a lot of people who are more expert at that kind of thing. There was a good talk, unfortunately didn't get on video, by Barry Cosman, who does the religion survey, the giant one that surveys 100,000 random Americans every 10 years. And it's a survey that showed that we doubled our numbers in the last 20 years. Where he points out there's a lot of things that you could do based on what psychologists have learned. But I would go online, find what experts are saying, like real experts are saying about that. In general, I don't think the image problem is really the issue. It's like it's not as if gay people had to go out and convince Christians that they were nice people per se. It's just they had to be more out to the point that Christians actually would get to know them and realize that they're not these horrible, crazy, perverted people. And in fact, that's what has been most effective, apart from ridiculing the Christian right, which has been very effective. And I have a lot to say about that, and I know people criticize the idea of ridiculing religion, but I think it has its uses when it's used properly. But the other is just the more that Christians got to know gay people, realized that there were gay people in their family, that created cognitive dissonance. You love your son, and you have this conflict between your love for your son and your understanding of how great his character is and the fact that he's gay. And then you have your religion saying that that's evil. Now, you have a lot of Christians who then shun their son or reject them, but you have a percentage, always a percentage, that resolve the contradiction by rejecting the religious view. And once they've rejected one religious dogma, they're on the road generally. So eventually, it might take a few years, they'll give up their religion eventually. So that's one kind of thing that you can do. Just be more out. Don't be. There's one thing I think Phil Plait said: "Don't be a dick." I don't think there's a problem with being a dick. I mean, it's more a question of don't encourage criminality, for example. Just basically demonstrate that you're a good citizen who's nonviolent. I mean, quite frankly, if you demonstrate that you're a good neighbor, it doesn't matter how cantankerous you are. That's the key thing that's going to change everything. But the other thing is simply confronting the lies. I mean, if you look at how, you might ask, how would Jews improve their image in Nazi Germany? Would that even be a rational question, right? So that's the thing. It's really, you have to basically confront the lies, the things that Jews are subhuman and Jews aren't even a member of the human species and things like that are just blatantly false. And this Hitler is an atheist thing. It's just blatantly false. And the more you spread the word and the actual evidence backed of it, the more people see that this claim that Hitler is an atheist is actually under challenge, the more percentage of people who've been told that he's an atheist are going to actually start looking into it, and when they look into it, they're going to find out that they've been lied to, that Hitler was really a believer, and that Nazism was really a Christian program. And so that's how you win. I mean, it's by picking off small percentages over time of recalcitrant believers. But you have to fight the lies in public. You have to get out there and prove that atheists are good citizens, and we're working on all these things. So yeah, that would be my recommendation. But there are other specific things that could be done that experts have been talking about as well.
One of the things that religious do is they recognize vulnerable populations or vulnerable people or find people when they're at a vulnerable time. There are a lot of people who've had an illness or an injury or something like that, and when they come through that, they have this narrative that God wanted me to learn something from this. It's great for you to talk about having a discussion in a pub, and I was actually a little annoyed that we talked about having a discussion in a pub. I heard Randy say that people might commit suicide if they didn't have their religion, and I think that's because we're not offering them a good alternative. I'm a surgeon who does lots of cancer surgeries, and frequently I have to tell people, you have cancer, we can't cure it, you're going to die. And there are standing by at our hospital lots of religious people, religious pamphlets, giving people a way to deal with that message falsely. And I challenge, what?
Yeah.
I challenge you guys to come up with, give us some help.
Yeah. No,
give us some help.
agree.
When I have to talk to a family and say, this person's, you're going to go through some bad times, how can I help them through that? Give us some help.
This is a good example, and I'm going to answer this question because I know what you mean. And this is for you and for anyone out there who is interested in pursuing this or has faced the same problem, who works in the medical industry, for example. This is exactly the kind of thing that people should be writing to Tom Flynn of the Council for Secular Humanism and other leaders of major national organizations that have the resources and the networks around the country to implement something like a pamphleting or like a set of pamphlets that could be made available, or actual people who are atheistic counselors who could make themselves available as volunteers as counselors.
There are tons of pastoral care people hired by the hospitals.
Yeah.
And it's a tough fight.
Yeah, it's a tough fight, but you could do something. And in fact, once you start doing something, you might start generating enough revenue from donations and so forth to accumulate over time.
I suggest it be a topic for the next Skepticon.
That could be, yeah. But one thing that's relevant to that is I totally agree that they need a worldview to replace, because basically they're clinging to a rock in a crazy sea, And you have the option of tell them to let go of the rock and just float freely, or you can point out that there's another rock that they can quickly jump to. And a lot of times people do that on their own. They jump from one religion to another or one sect to another. But we can do that as well. And that's my book, Sense and Goodness Without God, is designed to do that. It's like, this is another rock you can jump to. This is another complete worldview. It answers questions about the meaning of life, about how to face death, and all these other things. And it gives advice for further literature to read on these topics as well. So it talks about morality and all the things that concern people. So that's why I wrote the book. So that's one use for it. And so you can point that out. And hopefully other genius philosophers will grow up among you and write other excellent books like that.
Right. This question is actually for the audience out here. How many of you have actually picked up or bought a book from Richard here at Skepticon? I would encourage all of you to get all 3 of those books out there, especially those who are a big fan of Nailed. I could literally not have written Nailed without Richard Carrier. He was there from the beginning. He put me on the right track. He put me off the wrong tracks. And I literally could not have that book without Richard. And everything he's ever written has been brilliant. Even the books that he's only a part of, I would grab those books. You won't regret it at all.
Thanks. Yeah. Okay. Oh, do we have time for another?
I think this is the last one.
Okay.
Sense and Goodness is awesome. You should all read it. I'll spank you if you don't. There's this argument that I heard an apologist give, because we always say, if you're born here, you'll likely be a Christian. If you're born in Arabia or whatever, you'll likely be a Muslim. And this apologist kind of spinned it around and said, well, you wouldn't even be having that thought if you were born in a Muslim country. You have that because it's part of the culture here is to have access to the idea that people, I guess it's called knowledge theory or something like that.
Yeah.
What kind of response would you have to that?
Yeah, that's exactly one of the responses that were raised against Loftus at the Evangelical Philosophical Society. He responds to it very ably and thoroughly in Christian Delusion in his chapter on this.
So buy the book?
Yeah, so buy the book, yeah. Am I done?
Just in case it hasn't been said enough, buy the books.